A sans-culotte always has his sabre well sharpened, ready to cut off the ears of all opponents of the revolution. Anonymous revolutionary pamphlet. Peoples do not judge in the same way as courts of law. They do not hand down sentences, they throw down thunderbolts. They do not condemn kings, they drop them back into the void. And this justice is worth just as much as that of the courts. Maximillian Robespierre. What faction do I belong to? You yourselves. What is that faction which, since the revolution began, has crushed the factions and swept away hireling traitors? It is you. It is the people. It is the principles of the revolution. Robespierre's last speech. Few symbols of the French Revolution are as powerful as that of the sans-culotte. The phrase itself means without breeches and refers to the class of people who provided the revolution with its popular support and its growing radicalism. This is a position that stems from the 18th century and has continued today in the historiography. It attempts to connect the public life of the politicians' grand rhetoric and the everyday people whose politics were less rooted in ideological conviction than their material reality and class interests. Of course, a Marxist would say that these two facets are, in reality, inseparable. In essence, the revolution provided its own social interpretation. People wanted to know why it was that such a radical upheaval had taken place in French society, and found their answer in the figure of the sans-culotte. A sans-culotte is not merely a representation of the average person, or even the poor. Just because sans-culotte was of a middling sort did not mean that he was the median Frenchman. More accurately, in the public imagination, he was an artisan, a craftsperson, a shopkeeper, a wine merchant, or a cafe owner. On paper, not the type of person who would take much of an active role in politics in the 18th century, which was, very newly, reserved for professionals and the upper middle class. In retrospect, however, it was these sans-culottes who were blamed for the populism and demagogues that led to the terror of 1793 and 94. These were the type of people who were supposedly susceptible to Robespierre's rhetoric, who got swept up by his heady speeches about justice and a reckoning for the privileged. They were the ones who were determined to implement to the fullest extent Rousseau's ideas about the good life. Every man his own master, whose own modest plot of land was a sovereign nation. For Rousseau, property was at once the source of man's corruption and, if managed correctly, his liberation. In his discourse on the origin of inequality, he said, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground to whom it occurred to say, 'This is mine,' and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. It was the sans-culotte who demanded a republic and the destruction of the monarchy." Throughout the revolutionary years, it seemed, the wheel of history turned at their insistence. On the 22nd of September 1792, a republic was declared. That summer, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had attempted to flee Paris. The king left behind a signed letter attacking the revolution. He was placed under house arrest, put on trial, and the former royal couple were executed in January of 1793. The radical revolutionaries went to war in what they called a crusade for universal liberty. This went badly initially, and the growing sense of doom helped to further radicalize the revolution. The king's execution was deemed necessary so that the revolution would live. It was all the reactionary forces of Europe against France. Like never before, the whole nation was involved in the struggle, and mass conscription, known as the levée en masse, was mandated. At the same time, the revolution was a great centralizing force with Paris at its beating heart, further concentrated to the Committee of Public Safety, who set about creating a new world, instituting a new calendar, and rational measurements, which we still use as the metric system. Synonymous with the year-long period which later became known as the Reign of Terror is the French revolutionary Maximillian Robespierre, one of its chief orchestrators and orators, who was famously consumed by the machinery he had helped to construct. He was known for his unflinching commitment to the revolutionary cause, condemning those accused of counter-revolutionary sentiment to the guillotine. As the mouthpiece of the people, it was poetically fitting that prior to being led up to the blade, his jaw was shot by his fellow revolutionaries, so he was rendered inarticulate. A remarkable aspect of Robespierre's career is how his convictions warped as the pace of the revolution increased. Starting as a committed opponent of the death penalty, he ended up sending thousands to the guillotine. Beginning as a principled pacifist, he led a militant struggle against counter-revolution within and beyond the borders of France. In French popular consciousness, he has been blamed for the blood of the revolution, to the extent that he has been publicly disowned by those wishing to preserve it as an integral aspect of national identity and pride. Robespierre is partly a Cromwellian figure. Similar to Cromwell's post-Restoration exhumation and beheading, Robespierre was tossed in an unmarked grave and covered in quicklime following his execution. There was an attempt to sweep him under the carpet, or to emphasize only the bad in his revolutionary vision. Many of his principles, however, were highly noble, such as his commitment to humanity, equality, and the eradication of poverty and privilege. The period after the Terror was known as Thermidor, and it is perceived as a comparatively calmer phase of the revolution before the consulate of Napoleon, beginning in 1799. To some extent, the Revolutionary War had been won, in that France had managed to consolidate and partially extend its borders. It set French history on a course that was forever trying to steer a path clear of the extremes of Jacobin democracy versus a recast Ancien Régime. The leaders of the Thermidor period did not command the popular support of the Jacobins, and this allowed the capable and charismatic Napoleon Bonaparte to rise.